I sent a cruel message to my wife while she was at her ex-husband's house. They were desperate when they read the message and discovered that I knew everything. And the most curious thing is that night, I wasn't where she imagined. As she touched it, I watched. While she laughed, I listened. While she lied, I recorded it. I was in the next apartment, on the other side of the wall, sitting silently, watching everything happen in real time. I spent months preparing for that moment. Months tearing me apart in silence while I pretended not to see the deleted messages, the meaningless departures, the too long showers after hushed calls. I watched, pretended not to notice, but her every word, every disguised smile, every distant look, were thin needles piercing me inside. The kind of pain that doesn't bleed, but that eats away inside silently, like a leak behind a wall, invisible until everything collapses at once. And it collapsed. It started with a name mentioned by chance in a conversation between her and a friend. A name that hadn't appeared in years. A name that, until then, was just a shadow in the past. But that afternoon, as she spoke distractedly on the phone, something in the tone of her voice changed. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but I knew every inflection, every hesitation. She wasn't talking about a casual lunch. She was counting the minutes until she saw him again. The ex-husband. The man who one day promised to forget. The man I accepted as part of her past because I believed that, to truly love someone, you also need to embrace the scars. She didn't know I had installed the tracker in the car. Not even that the app on her cell phone, which she believed to be for recipes, was actually a digital mirror. With every step I took, I was there. Silent. Gift. Watching as a stranger in my own life, witnessing my story being rewritten by the hands of the woman I swore to love until the end. The day it all happened, I faked a business trip. I left with an empty suitcase and a tired smile. I said I would be back in 2 days, that I would miss you. She pretended to. He said he loved me, that he would wait for me, that he would count the minutes until I returned. And then, the moment I turned the corner, she called. Her voice changed again. More alive, hotter. I heard everything. Every word. Each suppressed groan of anticipation. Tonight, at your house, like before, she said. As before. Those words tore me apart. I rented the apartment next to my ex-husband's house without her knowing. I did this weeks before, when the encounters became too frequent to be coincidental. The building was old, the walls were thin. I installed fake cameras, microphones, routers. I turned the place into a betrayal bunker. Every inch of that house was before my eyes. That night, the world stopped. She arrived in a light dress, smiling like she hadn't smiled at me in years. Light, loose, almost adolescent. He opened the door with the confidence of someone who already knows he has won. They kissed as if time hadn't passed, as if I didn't exist, as if the years of marriage, the promises, the children, the house, were nothing more than an interval. I heard her whisper that she was nervous, that it seemed forbidden, and he replied, "It's because it's forbidden, and that's what makes it worth it. Be worth it." They drank wine. I counted the glasses. 4. She laughed loudly. I've never been able to make her laugh like that lately. He touched her face. She closed her eyes. She placed her forehead against his. She said she missed the way he made her feel alive. I wondered when she started to feel dead with me. I wrote the message right then and there. Hands shaking, heart beating in temples. I didn't plan the words, they gushed out. Have fun. I'm in the apartment next door. I heard everything. I saw everything. I hope the past is worth more than the shame that will come. It took seconds for her phone to vibrate. I saw the smile disappear. He read along. They turned pale. The wine turned to gall. She ran to the window. He looked around. He didn't see me. He started to sweat. They locked the door. They turned off the lights. But it was too late. The damage was already done. She tried to call. I ignored it. Tried to send a message. I blocked it. Their despair was my silent revenge. But there, as I saw the chaos I had created, I felt no relief. I felt pain. Because the truth is that no one wins from betrayal. Everyone loses. She lost confidence. He lost his pride. And I lost the one thing I swore I would never lose, my peace. Over the next few days, they tried to find me. Mutual friends called. Family members sent messages saying it was all a misunderstanding. She wrote a letter that she left on my door. I didn't open it. Maybe one day. Maybe never. I just wanted to disappear for a while. Breathe away from everything. Away from her. But then, amid the silence of the following days, a new presence entered my life. An unexpected woman, with a calm smile and eyes that didn't ask for anything, just listened. Someone who also knew the bitter taste of disappointment. Little by little, without rushing, she reconstructed me. And maybe, just maybe, that betrayal was the beginning of something I never imagined experiencing again. The question that still doesn't let me sleep is, how did they find out I was there? Because, among the many cameras and microphones, there was a recording, a single recording, that should never have been made. A whispered phrase, a name said out of context. And in that instant, everything changed. But this is something that neither she, nor he, nor even I expected. A forgotten piece, a tiny detail that became an avalanche. And when that truth comes to light, maybe, just maybe, the real betrayed in this story wasn't me. Welcome to the channel. Here, we make it clear from the beginning, we do not support any type of betrayal. All stories told are fictitious, created to show how infidelity can destroy lives, families and hearts. The moral of each story is simple, whoever cheats, loses much more than he imagines. Now, take a deep breath. Get ready. You're about to hear a story shocking, realistic and unforgettable. Daniel has always had a restrained soul, the kind that prefers silence to exposure, detail to ostentation, constancy to spectacle. He was a methodical man, with a calm speech, eyes that always seemed to observe more than they said. He had worked for almost 2 decades as a civil engineer, and over time, he was recognized for the precision with which he planned structures, and for the calm he maintained even in moments of tension. He was not a man of explosions, nor of grand gestures, but of small attitudes that, together, sustained an entire life. He married Laura on a late autumn afternoon, on a day when the sky seemed to have stopped just for them. They met when they were young, during a university lecture, and since then they built a story that, from the outside, seemed as solid as reinforced concrete. Laura, in turn, was made of another material. While he sought stability, she lived in constant movement. Not in the sense of external agitation, but in an internal, intense, invisible dynamism. She was a literature teacher and passionate about everything that touched the human soul. He quoted Clarice like someone breathing and crying at the endings of films that no one else seemed to understand. She was sweet to others, but hard on herself. Demanding, deep, with an attentive look and emotions on display. He had a sensitivity that meant that, sometimes, even the sound of the wind was a reason to lose himself in thought for hours. Daniel had always admired this about her, this internal world so vast, so full of questions. And she, in turn, always felt safe next to him, as if she could allow herself to fly, knowing that someone trustworthy was waiting for her on the ground. They lived for years in harmony. They bought a discreet townhouse, with a light facade, with large windows and a garden that Laura cultivated with care. On weekends, while she tended to the lavender and azaleas, he organized tools in the back shed or tested new recipes. They discovered that Daniel had a talent for making homemade pasta, and Sundays were baptized with this silent, almost sacred ritual. Dinners were long, accompanied by red wine and conversations about books, works of art, human dilemmas and plans for the future. They didn't have children, by mutual choice, and they always said that the love between them was enough to fill that house. But time, as always, is a patient sculptor. It shapes the spaces, eroding some edges, accentuating silences. Laura began to dedicate herself more intensely to classes and school extension projects. I arrived late, involved with the students, the events, the readings. Daniel, in turn, had taken on a management position at the company, which left him more time away from home, more nights in meetings, and earlier at his desk. Life as a couple, little by little, was replaced by life in parallel. There were no fights, there was no shouting. Just a slight distance that grew as the days went by. They still slept holding hands sometimes, they still looked at each other fondly at breakfast. But they were no longer heard so loudly. Between the two, there was absolute respect. Neither of them was the impulsive type, neither would ever think of hurting the other on purpose. They were adults. Companions. Partners. Friends. And that was enough. Or so they believed. The truth, however, is that the absence of major conflicts did not mean plenitude. Peace sometimes hid a certain loneliness. Laura began to write more at night, isolated in the small office. Daniel started hiking on Saturdays with a group of colleagues, activities that he himself said were a way to clear the mind. Sunday dinners continued, but with less wine, less conversation, more screens on. And yet, when they asked themselves if they were okay, the answer came automatically, of course they were. They became, without realizing it, two strangers who knew each other well. Two bodies that shared the same roof, the same memories, but that no longer touched each other with the same soul. It wasn't anyone's fault. There was no victim. There was no villain. There was only time, routine, tiredness. And, above all, the silence, the one that comes slowly, that doesn't hurt all at once, but that empties the space between two smiles, between two hugs, between two words that were left unsaid. Still, there was love. A love perhaps older, more mature, quieter. But it was still love. A love that was expressed in small gestures, the coffee brewed before she woke up, the coat left on the chair when it got cold, the folded towel, the note with a bad joke left on the table. The kind of love that doesn't appear in photos on social media, but that can be seen in the way one cares for the other even when words fail. That year, they decided to travel to celebrate their wedding anniversary. They went to a quiet city, with narrow streets and old houses. They walked through alleys, took photos, had dinner by candlelight. But even there, in the midst of trying to relive what once united them so strongly, something seemed out of place. There was no tension. There was an absence. That absence that doesn't scream, but weighs. The absence of a flame that once warmed and now only seemed to illuminate with coldness. Back in the routine, they tried to adjust the clocks. They went to couples therapy for a brief period. The therapist said there was a lot of affection there, a lot of admiration, but little desire, little presence. Laura cried once. Daniel was silent. They left the room without holding hands. And they followed. When meeting friends, they seemed perfect. The balanced couple. The example couple. Everyone said that. And maybe, in a way, they were. They never betrayed each other, they never disrespected each other. They shared plans, divided bills, remembered birthdays. But at home, alone, the silences were still too long. The looks, evasive. The touch, scarce. Laura signed up for an evening creative writing class. He said he needed to regain his passion for words. Daniel thought it was great. He said he supported it. He also started taking care of a project at the company that required more traveling, more nights out. They both supported each other. They both understood each other. But both were also absent from each other, so delicately that it almost seemed natural. The neighborhood was calm, with traditional families, where everyone greeted each other on Sunday mornings. The building next to theirs sat empty for many years. It had recently been renovated and some apartments began to be rented on a seasonal basis. Daniel commented one day that he found it interesting how the landscape changed even in the most stable places. Laura laughed and said that everything changes, even what seems immobile. And then, once again, they sank into silence. Over time, Daniel started to arrive later. He said there was always something to resolve. Laura too. Sometimes one slept before the other. Sometimes dinner was just a plate left in the fridge. And pasta Sundays have become an exception. But despite everything, there was still complicity. There was still the habit. There was still the habit of loving. And it was within this scenario, of calm love, stable life, and silences that were too long, that something began to move. Something small, almost imperceptible. A longer look. A more restrained smile. A more felt absence. And little by little, without fanfare, the foundation of that life built with so much care began to shake. A subtle, discreet tremor, as if the ground beneath them was no longer as firm as it seemed. But no one noticed. Nobody imagined. And perhaps that is exactly where the danger lies. Not in the shouting, not in the fights. But in the prolonged silences, in the habitual absences, in the words that are left unsaid, and that make space for the unexpected to enter. Slowly. In silence. Without warning. The night Daniel decided not to take the flight to Lisbon was the same night he realized he had stopped being the protagonist of his own life. It was a work trip, one of those that he would take with his eyes closed, with the precision of someone who organizes suitcases without even thinking about what they are storing. But that day, something held him back. A silent premonition, a formless restlessness. He walked to the airport, handed the ticket to the attendant, smiled as if everything was fine, and then turned around. He called the office, said something had come up and that he would be boarding the next day. He took a taxi but didn't go home. Nearby, in an old cafe, he discreetly rented a small apartment for the season, the same building where weeks before he had noticed unusual activity on the ground floor. There was no rational reason, there was no proof. Just a noise deep in the soul. A subtle but constant discomfort, as if the air had been heavier for weeks. On the way, he remembered a recent night, when Laura arrived home with teary eyes and a changed perfume. He didn't ask anything. He never asked. He was the type to observe in silence, trying to decipher the unspoken words. But that night, in particular, remains etched in my memory. She walked through the door with a smile that didn't match her look. When she kissed him on the cheek, he felt like the touch wasn't his. It was as if he was just carrying out a ritual that no longer made sense. From then on, the signs began to organize themselves in his mind like pieces of a puzzle that he never wanted to put together. In the rented apartment, a few meters from Laura's ex-husband's house, Daniel began to observe the movements. Not obsessively, but with the coldness of someone who needs to face a truth before being devoured by it. He installed discreet cameras, microphones in the building's hallways, listening points at the garage entrance. I didn't want to catch anything. I wanted to understand. I wanted to know if I was crazy or just waking up from a dream. Laura's face recently seemed strange to him. Too familiar to be unfamiliar, but strange nonetheless. Like an old song that sounds different once you know its true story. The following weeks were a succession of disturbing routines. Laura would go out on Thursdays in the late afternoon saying she would be on duty at school. Always on Thursdays. Always with the same bag, the same light dress, the same sparkle in her eyes. Daniel knew it wasn't about class. But he didn't question it. I made mental notes, filed the details, and waited for the right moment. During this period, the couple practically stopped sharing schedules. When one arrived, the other was already asleep. When the other woke up, it was already late. It was as if they had become shadows of their own presence. At the company, Daniel maintained his routine, but with his mind far away. He started to delegate more, trust less. At home, he maintained the same rituals, but with a thicker silence. He started leaving unanswered notes, small messages left on purpose to see if they would be read, if they would spark something. Nothing. Laura seemed absent, even when present. There was no aggression, no coldness. Just polite disinterest, like someone greeting a neighbor they know but not like. And ironically, that hurt him more than any scream. One night he arrived earlier than usual. He found the house silent, as usual. But there was a different scent in the air. Wine, perhaps. Flowers. Her dress was thrown over the back of the armchair, and her cell phone was left on silent mode on the kitchen table. He didn't make a sound. He passed through the rooms like a ghost. He picked up the device, looked at the screen and hesitated. I had never done that. I had never crossed that limit. But that night, something compelled him. And when he unlocked the screen, 3 messages were enough. I'm on my way, I'll see you where always, I can't wait to see you again. Nothing explicit. Nothing indecent. But everything was there. His absence, the presence of the other, the enthusiasm he hadn't seen in months. He turned off the device and put it back in place. He went up to his room and lay down on the bed as if he didn't know. The next morning, Laura was still sleeping when he left. And on the way to work, he decided it was time to confirm. To know. To be sure. Doubt killed him more than the possible truth. And that's when he started planning. The following Thursday, he pretended he was going to travel again. Bags packed, kiss on the forehead, promises of a connection. But this time, instead of going to the airport, he returned to his rented apartment. He turned on the monitors, adjusted the headphones and waited. Laura's car left at exactly 6:07 p.m. She wore the same light dress, and there was a light red lipstick, the kind she didn't wear to teach. He parked in the same spot, walked quickly, looked around before ringing the doorbell. The door opened. He didn't see the face. But he knew who it was. And then, the sound. The muffled greetings, the nervous laughter, the clinking of glasses. He muted the audio and just watched. 4 hours. The screen showed the entrance to the building, the dimly lit living room, her reflection in the glass of the balcony. She smiled. At that moment, his heart accelerated. Not out of anger. But observation. It was real. That woman who shared his bed, who knew every scar on his body, now smiled at another with a shine he hadn't seen in a long time. And he couldn't do anything. Nothing but watching. In the early morning, she returned home. He entered slowly, took off his shoes at the entrance, walked to the bedroom. Daniel pretended to sleep. She touched him on the shoulder, whispered that she was tired. He responded with a murmur. And, in the dark, the two slept side by side, like two strangers who happened to share the same bed. In the following days, he continued monitoring. Not for revenge. But why did I need to understand? Knowing how far it was going. Knowing if it was something temporary or permanent. He discovered the encounters had been going on for months. Always in the same place, same time, same gestures. And, little by little, what hurt was not the act itself, but the constancy. The repetition. The naturalness with which Laura lied. How she smiled. With which she would come home and kiss his forehead as if everything was normal. It was then that Daniel began to write. Not letters. Not tickets. But a message. Just one. Long. It needs. Cruel. Not with offensive words, but with truths. With sentences she couldn't read without shaking. Words that would cut like blades. He kept that message for days. Rewrote, edited, adjusted. Until she was exactly what she wanted, the coldest mirror of reality. The following Thursday, he repeated the ritual. Suitcase ready. Kiss. Farewell. And when she entered that building again, with the same lightness of someone who believes everything is under control, he watched with frightening calm. He waited for the right moment. And when he saw the lights go out, he sent the message. A single shot. Short. Lethal. Her cell phone vibrated. She read it. And in that instant, everything changed. She looked at the man beside her, her smile faded, her hands shook. The phone fell to the floor. He took the device and read it too. The silence was broken by ragged breathing, by hurried footsteps, by altered voices. And there, in that room, between the spilled wine and the desperate looks, the castle of lies began to collapse. What they didn't know, is that that message was just the beginning. Laura couldn't stop looking at her cell phone. The blank screen reflected his pale expression, completely blank. The words of the message echoed in her mind with a violence she never imagined she would feel. He knew. I knew everything. And what hurt her even more was the certainty that this was not an impulsive message. There was strategy, coolness, precision. It was the hand of someone who had watched in silence for too long. The man in front of him, the same man who had once been part of his buried past, now tried to understand what had just happened. With his eyes wide and his face drenched in sweat, he stammered in disjointed sentences trying to find an explanation for something that was already completely out of control. She got up from the chair without knowing where to go, feeling her legs weaken, her stomach churning. The feeling was that of a sudden punishment, of a sentence received before the trial even began. He asked if she thought he, Daniel, was there, nearby. She didn't respond. He just walked to the window and looked around, as if expecting to see him emerge from the shadows. But the street was silent, cold, distant. It was then that she realized something that made her shudder. For months, Daniel had been too absent to be just an absence. It was too quiet to be just tired. It was too far away to be just routine. Maybe, all that time, he knew. Maybe every look, every silence, every restrained touch was part of a plan. But what she still didn't understand was why that message had been sent just now. Why not before? Why not the first day? The night was long. The man she was with insisted that she call, try to explain, beg for forgiveness. But Laura couldn't move a finger. She felt exposed, stripped not of clothes, but of any trace of dignity. He left in silence, and she was left alone in that room. At dawn, he returned home. Each step on the stairs felt like they weighed tons. The door was unlocked. There was a note on the kitchen table, just 2 words, you know. There was nothing else. Not his clothes, not shoes, not even the smell of coffee. The house was empty. And what hurt most was realizing that, even after everything, he hadn't bothered to scream, to demand explanations, to confront. It just disappeared. Days passed without news. The cell phone remained silent. She called and went straight to voicemail. I sent messages that remained unread. He started asking coworkers and mutual friends, until a close friend said he had asked for a vacation. He didn't say where he was going, he didn't give any deadlines. Just left. The disappearance, instead of relieving her, left her suffocating. It was like a silent but profound punishment. And more than that, fear took over. Was he planning something? Any revenge? Was that still the beginning? For days later, he returned. He knocked on the door of the house like a visitor. When she opened it, her heart almost jumped out of her chest. He was there, with the same calm look as always, but something inside him seemed dead. He entered, didn't ask for permission, didn't talk about longing. He just sat on the couch and watched her for long seconds, until he finally broke the silence. He said he didn't want to hear justifications, that he already had all the answers. He said that what she destroyed was not just the marriage, but the very memory of everything they lived through. That for weeks he heard, saw, wrote down. That he could sue her, expose her, ruin her. But I preferred something more subtle. More efficient. Laura tried to speak. He tried to say he didn't know why he did what he did. He tried to find in words what his heart could no longer feel. He said it wasn't for lack of love. That maybe it was lack, confusion, emptiness. Daniel laughed. A dry laugh, full of irony. He asked her if she really believed it was possible to love someone and, at the same time, destroy them behind their back. He said that what hurt most was not the betrayal itself, but the ease with which she came home, sat next to him, talked about the day, touched his hand at night. As if he were blind. As if he were stupid. She cried. I begged. It said that he too had moved away, that the two of them allowed their love to die a little every day. That she was looking for something that had been lost. He was silent. He watched her crumble in front of him with a kind of coldness he himself was unaware of. And then, finally, he said there was something she needed to know. Something that would completely change the understanding of that story. That there was a detail, a small fact that she ignored, but that had turned all his pain into a plan. A plan that was now complete. Laura stood, her eyes red, trying to understand what he was talking about. He asked if it was about the divorce, if he had recorded everything, if he planned to disclose anything. Daniel shook his head. Said it was bigger. Much bigger. He said the moment she entered that building for the third time, he made a decision. And that the message she received was not the end. It was the trigger. Because while she thought he was far away, on the other side of the country, he was right next door. On the next wall. In the apartment next door. Listening. Recording. Observing. She took a step back. Her face paled even more. He started to shake. He asked if he was saying that. And before he finished, he confirmed it. It was there. Heard everything. Saw everything. I knew what she said, how she said it, what she did, when she did it. And that during that time, while she laughed, he cried. While she lied, he planned. And then, Laura started putting the pieces together. His absence. The trips that never happened. His silences. The fact that I never confronted her. Because he wanted to go further. I wanted more than a confrontation. I wanted her to feel everything. She fell to her knees. He asked if he had shown it to anyone. He didn't respond. He asked if he would publish it. He said he didn't know. That maybe yes. Maybe not. That now it was she who would live in doubt, in waiting, in fear. Exactly how he lived. But there was more. Which still wasn't everything. That there was a detail. A secret. A small point out of the script. Something that completely changed what she thought she knew about him, about herself, and about that man with whom she shared her bed for so many years. Laura couldn't breathe properly. I felt my chest close. He asked, with a choked voice, what else he wanted. And then, he stood up. He approached. He knelt in front of her. And in a low but firm voice, he whispered, "You didn't realize, but what you destroyed, wasn't just a marriage. It was the trust of someone who always knew more than you knew. And now, the time has come for you to know what he did with that broken trust." She didn't understand. I was still stuck in anger, in shame, in fear. But there was something in that look of his that wasn't just pain. It was the certainty of those who still kept the last letter. And that letter would be revealed soon. Daniel got up from the floor with calculated slowness, keeping his eyes fixed on her, as if watching a piece about to fall from the board. His body seemed calm, but there was a weight contained in his shoulders, a tension that didn't come from anger, but from the precision of someone who knows exactly what they're doing. He walked to the door, turned the handle calmly, as if he were just a visitor leaving the house after some coffee. Laura tried to get up, but her knees gave out. Her heart beat at an uneven pace, and her confused mind struggled to put together the puzzle of what she had just heard. I knew that the world as I knew it had collapsed, but I was sure that the real collapse was yet to come. And that was when Daniel turned, before leaving, and dropped a metal key on the table. He just said, "Use it when you're ready to know." And left. For 2 days, she didn't touch the key. He barely slept, he barely ate. She felt exhausted and anesthetized, as if her body were present but her soul wandered in a suspended state of anguish. On the third night, after another unsuccessful attempt to reach him by phone or on social media, she decided to use the key. The address was on the note attached to the keychain. A street she barely knew, a discreet neighborhood, far from their usual route. It arrived close to 9 at night, the sky was overcast and a cold wind ripped at the skin. He climbed the stairs of the old building, and on the 3rd floor he found the dark wooden door. He turned the key and entered slowly. The light was on. In the center of the room, a notebook sits on a simple table, with a single post-it stuck to the lid, "Play." She hesitated for seconds that seemed like forever, then clicked on the video. The image loaded, and Daniel's face appeared in the center of the screen. The light was dim, the environment silent. He spoke directly to the camera, his voice firm and without any sign of hesitation. He told, in detail, how it all started. How he became suspicious, how he found traces, how he decided not to confront, but to watch. He said that apartment was the place where he watched her for months. He showed the cameras, files, audios, recordings with date, time and location. Laura watched without blinking, feeling each word like a knife piercing layers of her own past. But then, he said something that made her freeze. He said the betrayal didn't surprise him. That what destroyed him was realizing who she had chosen to cheat with. And there, the tone of the recording changed. Daniel got up, left the camera's field of view and, upon returning, placed a sealed envelope on the table. He said that envelope contained a copy of an official document. "If you still don't understand the size of your choice," he said, "perhaps this will clarify." Laura paused the video, got up, looked for the physical envelope that was exactly where it showed. He opened it with shaking hands. "Read the headline. Bank document. In her name and, her ex-husband. A property purchase contract. Dated 2 months ago. A property purchased with part of the money transferred from Daniel's company, through a joint account that she had access to." The blow was clear. She had been an accomplice to a crime, even if unconsciously. But there was no defense there. The data was there, cold, unquestionable. He sat back down, turned on the video again. Daniel now spoke with a different tone. There was no more pain. Just detachment. He said he had left everything with the lawyers. That he wouldn't prosecute her criminally, not at that moment, but that she should prepare herself. Because the consequences would come, sooner or later. He also said that he no longer lived in that city. That he had made the decision to rebuild his life far away, without leaving a trace. Who, for months, lived with the image of the woman he loved most transforming into someone he barely recognized. And now there was nothing more to say. Laura turned off the laptop and cried with her whole body. They weren't silent tears, they were violent sobs, as if he was vomiting guilt. "I couldn't understand how it got to that point. How you allowed everything to go so astray. I tried to remember when I started lying, but the line was so thin that it seemed impossible to identify." He remembered the conversations with his ex, the first messages, the shy encounters that became frequent. She remembered how he made her laugh, how he told her she was still the same as before. "And now, I realized how blind I was. Used. Manipulated. The next day, Laura looked for a lawyer. She wanted to know how legally she could answer for the contract she had signed with her ex-husband. I wanted to understand if there was a way out, if there was a way. The answer was harsh: she was exposed. The signature, the deposits, everything was legally linked to it. And now, without Daniel by her side, without the support of the man she betrayed, she was completely alone. She tried to contact her ex-husband, but he was also gone. Deactivated accounts, left the apartment. Disappeared as if it had never existed. In the days that followed, notifications began to arrive. Banks requesting clarification. The Federal Revenue. An anonymous email with prints of messages between her and her ex, without identification. A warning that if he didn't get his taxes in order, he could face a formal investigation. It was the beginning of a spiral. And what consumed her most was knowing that Daniel was behind it, not as a vengeful man, but as someone who just delivered the truth to the light. Then, one gray morning, he received one last letter. Coming from an unknown address, handwritten in a handwriting she would recognize anywhere. Daniel said he had started a process to transfer part of the house into her name. He said he didn't want anything from that life. Who only took his clothes, his books, and the peace he regained. It ended with a sentence: "I hope that one day you understand that I didn't lose you. You are the one who lost yourself." After weeks of torment, of going back and forth to the lawyer's office, of sleepless nights trying to understand how someone so meticulous had let everything slip, Laura woke up one Saturday to the phone ringing. She was an old friend from high school. They said they had seen Daniel in a small coastal town, in a cafe near the pier, talking to a blonde woman with a serene smile. Which looked fine. Quiet. That there was something in his gaze that reminded him of who he was before everything else. And it was there, alone in the room that used to be theirs, among the furniture that had lost its meaning and the silences that had become unbearable, that Laura understood. Daniel had won not out of revenge, but for leaving in one piece, while she, who thought she had control, was now broken into parts that might never come back together again. She betrayed love, but it was love that condemned her. No shouting, no scandals. Only with the precision of someone who loves so much that they would rather walk away than allow themselves to be destroyed. And at that moment, with no one around, Laura looked at the door, as if waiting for him to return. But I knew, deep down, that he was already very far away. Far beyond. Perhaps, in a place where the betrayed not only survive, but are reborn. Laura spent weeks living in a state that doctors would call emotional exhaustion, but which, for her, was something closer to dry mourning, without ceremony or flowers. It was mourning without a coffin, where what had died was not a person, but the version of herself that she still believed was good. He walked around the house with silent steps, avoiding mirrors, as if his own reflection were a living accusation. Daniel's smell still lingered on some forgotten pieces of clothing in the closet, but there was no longer a presence, just traces. She tried to continue with her routine, answer work calls, answer emails, but everything seemed mechanical, disconnected from meaning. His absence was now more than silence. It was a constant reminder that even when someone isn't shouting, they could be saying everything. The dilemma that was emerging within her went beyond regret. It wasn't just about what she had done, but what she had failed to notice. Why, in so many years, had she never realized that Daniel would be capable of such a cold, surgical response? Why did you assume that love would make you passive, predictable, submissive? Maybe because he confused kindness with weakness. Maybe because, deep down, she believed that, despite everything, he would never leave her. That was what gnawed at her the most, having thrown away the only bond that still linked her to a part of herself that was still human. The legal proceedings began to drag on. Although Daniel said he would not prosecute her criminally, financial agencies began to investigate. The atypical movements drew attention. She was called to provide clarification. He sat in front of a cold table, under the gaze of two auditors who were not there to interpret intentions, only facts. He tried to explain, he tried to show that there was no criminal intention, that it had been manipulated. But the document was signed by her. The transfers made by her. The contract validated by your name. And it no longer mattered whether he was conscious or not. The law doesn't care about emotional fragility. Furthermore, she discovered that her ex-husband was being investigated in other similar cases. Financial fraud, tax evasion, allegations of fraud. And now, she was part of the web. She felt dirty. Accomplice to something that I would never have accepted if I had stopped to think. The scandal, however, was still silent. There were no headlines, no public exposure yet. But it was as if life was just waiting for the right moment to change the game for good. She started attending therapy sessions. At first, he said little. He said he was there out of obligation, on the recommendation of his lawyer. But little by little, the words came out, and with them, came memories that I didn't even know I had. He revised his trajectory. You questioned your choices. He remembered how invisible he felt, how he began to look for meaning outside, instead of looking inside. He didn't use the word betrayal. It was as if I still couldn't say that term without feeling nauseated. He referred to what happened as the decision or the deviation. But with each session, he got closer to the truth. She hadn't just betrayed Daniel. She had betrayed herself, her convictions, her limits. And now he was there, picking up the rubble of a choice made on impulse, sustained by lies and ended by a cruel silence. During a late afternoon walk, he met an old friend of the couple. He asked about Daniel, said he hadn't seen him in a while. She hesitated for a second, then just smiled and said he was fine, living abroad. The friend smiled back and wished him luck. But at that moment, Laura felt the weight of having to maintain, for an indefinite period of time, the image of someone who no longer exists. She was no longer the respectable wife, the admired woman. It was the one that stayed. The one that was left. And although no one knew the details, she did. And that was enough to keep the shame alive. One morning, she decided to go back to the cafe where she used to go with Daniel on Sundays. The atmosphere was the same, the tables still had the same old glass marks. He asked for the coffee he usually drank. He sat in the same corner. He observed the couples around him, their laughter, their intertwined hands, their passionate eyes. And he thought about how many of those people might also be on the edge of an abyss without realizing it. How many smiled while carrying hidden pain. For the first time, he felt like standing up and warning them. Saying that betrayal doesn't start with a kiss, but with silence. That destruction does not come with a scream, but with the absence of words. But she remained silent. Because did you know that no one listens to advice from a broken woman? That same week, he received news that Daniel had sold his share of the company. His lawyer called just to let her know she didn't need to worry. All documents were being transferred and there would be no financial link between them from that moment on. It was the official end of any bond. He had cut even the invisible ones. And that, in a way, hurt more than any accusation. It was as if he said, with actions, neither you, nor anything that comes from you, is part of my life anymore. One Sunday, when he opened the mailbox, he found a letter with no return address. The paper was thick, the handwriting elegant. Inside, a single sheet folded with precision. It was a short message. Daniel said he had met someone. That it was not a replacement, nor an escape, but a new beginning. That I was relearning to feel, to trust, to breathe. And that he hoped that one day she would also find her own peace. There was no tone of superiority. It was just a final goodbye. No regrets. No grudges. Just closure. Laura kept the letter. He read and reread for hours. And that night, for the first time, he didn't cry. There was something liberating about that pain. Because now I knew he was okay. Which would follow? That he had survived. And in a way, that was all she could have wanted. There was nothing left to fix. There was no apology that could reverse what had been done. But there was a chance of not making a mistake again. And that, perhaps, was the only shred of dignity he still had left. He started writing. Not to publish, not to justify. But to understand. I created entire chapters about the days with Daniel, the nights of silence, the tortuous thoughts, the repressed desires. On each page, he vented part of his guilt, buried a memory, reconstructed an image. Writing became his form of healing. I didn't know if anyone would ever read it. But he knew that, at least, every word written was one more brick in the reconstruction of what was left of him. The decreasing action of his own story was not made of calm, but of lucidity. And lucidity, unlike pain, does not destroy, it only reveals. And what Laura saw now, in front of the mirror, was a woman stripped of vanity, of certainties, of illusions. But a woman who, even devastated, was still standing. Ready, perhaps, to hear what fate still had to say to her. Because she knew, deep down, that every story needs an end. But not every end needs to be destruction. Sometimes just be true. The months advanced like a slow, dense river, carrying fragments of everything Laura tried to forget. She moved to a smaller apartment, further away from the memories embedded in the corners of the old house. The new space was silent, impersonal, yet without personality. The furniture was there, but the soul seemed absent, as if it inhabited a temporary space, without roots. The bare walls held no history, and in a way, that was a relief. There were no more pictures with smiling memories, nor shelves with books chosen for two. There was just her and the emptiness that, over time, stopped being scary and became part of the routine. In the new neighborhood, no one knew her. No one knew that, months before, she had been part of a life that seemed perfect on the outside and tragic on the inside. She went unnoticed, which was exactly what she wanted. He walked the streets in neutral clothes, rarely making eye contact with anyone. I avoided busy supermarkets, preferring hidden cafes and alternative opening hours. I wanted peace, but I couldn't find it. I wanted forgiveness, but there was no one to ask. The silence still spoke loudly, albeit in a different way. He was more mature, more resigned. Pain had given way to reflection. The shame was still there, but it was accompanied by a clarity that was previously lacking. One cloudy late afternoon, while organizing old papers, he found a notebook in which Daniel used to record ideas, technical drawings, project sketches. He leafed through them carefully, like someone touching relics. Between the pages, she found a drawing he had made years before, a sketch of the house where they lived together. There were notes around the edges, suggestions for reforms that never happened. On the back, a handwritten note, almost as a reminder to himself, structures fail when details are ignored. The sentence hit him like a punch. It was about architecture, but in that context, it was about them. Laura finally realized that no marriage breaks down all at once. It's the small negligence, the gestures not made, the words swallowed. It's the ignored details that eat away at the foundation until everything collapses. A few days later, while leaving a supermarket, Laura came across a woman who looked familiar. Intense gaze, firm expression, but with a welcoming smile. He recognized her from afar. She was the woman Daniel had been seen with in the small coastal town. It wasn't jealousy he felt, but a strange mixture of curiosity and restlessness. The woman approached, taking her time, and said she knew who she was. He said there was no grudge, that he never wanted to take anyone's place, and that he had met Daniel by chance, when he wasn't looking for anyone, just peace. Laura stood still. I listened, but I didn't know how to react. The woman, noticing the embarrassment, continued calmly. He said Daniel spoke little about the past, but when he did, it was with respect. Who never diminished her, never exposed her. And that despite the pain, she still considered it part of his story. I didn't come here to judge you, she said, looking into Laura's eyes with a calm firmness, "I just wanted you to know that he doesn't hate you. He just protected himself from the pain. And he chose to follow." Laura, unable to contain her emotion, asked how he was. The woman smiled slightly and said he was fine, lighter, more whole. Who spent his days designing volunteer projects, helping local communities, living simply. Who rarely talked about what he experienced, but who carried everything inside, without needing to tell. And then, like someone who understands when to leave, she said it was time to move on. She lightly touched Laura's arm and walked away, leaving behind a trail of peace that contrasted with the turmoil inside her. That night, Laura came home and cried for the first time without anger. She cried not because she lost Daniel, but because she finally understood who he was. And because I was too blind to see. She regretted every gesture she didn't make, every look she averted, every opportunity she had to redeem herself before it was too late. But, more than regretting, he felt something new, a sincere desire for transformation. Not for him, not for pride, but for herself. He realized that the greatest betrayal was not against Daniel, it was against his own essence. The next day, she looked for a local institution and offered herself as a volunteer. He started helping with simple tasks, such as organizing donations, cleaning rooms, serving meals. He didn't talk much. He didn't say who he was, what he did before, or what he had experienced. It just served. In silence, like someone carrying out a silent penance. Little by little, faces began to smile at her. The children learned his name. The elderly waited for their visitors. And, amidst so many fragments of broken stories, she began to stitch her own together. One rainy afternoon, while reading to a group of young people in a stuffy room, he heard a familiar voice behind him. It wasn't Daniel. It was his lawyer. A discreet, formal man, always kind. He asked for a minute. Laura followed him into the hallway. He took an envelope out of his pocket and said that Daniel had asked for it to be delivered. There was nothing urgent. Just one message. She took the envelope with trembling hands, thanked her and returned home with it in her lap, as if she were carrying something too fragile to be exposed to the wind. She opened it carefully, sitting at the kitchen table. There was only one sheet. Daniel said he found out, through mutual acquaintances, about the volunteer work. That he was happy that she was looking for new beginnings. That this didn't erase the past, but perhaps it made space for a new type of memory. He said he didn't know if they would ever speak again, but that he wished her a dignified life, with light, with truth. And it ended with an unexpected sentence: "You were always better than your choices. You just didn't realize it in time." Laura closed her eyes. There was no explicit forgiveness there, no promises, no bridges. But there was humanity. And, in that moment, he understood that perhaps true forgiveness doesn't need to be said out loud. Just be lived. He went to the bookshelf and took out the notebook where he had been writing for months. He opened it to a new page and, for the first time, wrote a letter addressed to him. I wouldn't send it. But I needed to write. In the letter, she did not apologize. She was grateful. I was grateful that I didn't retaliate with hate. I would like to thank you for showing that it is possible to leave without destroying. And, above all, I was grateful for having left in her something more valuable than any love, the desire to be better. It was night when he finished writing. The wind hit the windows hard, as if it wanted to clean away the remains of the past. Laura got up, turned off the lights, and sat in the armchair with a blanket over her shoulders. He looked outside and, for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel afraid of tomorrow. There was still pain, there were still shadows. But now there was also silence. A silence full of purpose. And deep down, she knew. I was about to understand, finally, what it means to start over. Not rebuilding what was lost, but building something completely new, where guilt is not the foundation, but conscience. Where we don't live to correct the past, but to not repeat it. Because sometimes the real punishment is not what is imposed on us, but what we choose to carry. And Laura, at that moment, decided to leave the weight behind. To finally discover who he could still become. The letter Laura wrote was kept in her drawer for weeks. He never intended to send it, but writing it was the ritual that was needed to close the wound that no longer bled, but still hurt to the touch. Over time, his routine adjusted to a new cadence. Volunteer work stopped being a hiding place and became an essential part of his identity. She felt useful, present, alive in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. He did not expect redemption nor did he seek applause. I had understood that certain pains do not require healing, but acceptance. He began to see the world with different eyes, more humble, more attentive. The judgments I made before dissolved into a bitter understanding. No one is free from making mistakes, but few have the courage to admit it, and even fewer, to remake themselves. The scandal involving her ex-husband broke out the following year. Financial fraud affected other women, other companies, other lives. He was arrested at the border, trying to escape under a false identity. In the press conference released by the authorities, his name was displayed alongside falsified documents, accounts in tax havens and a history of emotional manipulation as extensive as his criminal record. He was formally accused of money laundering, ideological falsehood and criminal association. At the hearing, he denied everything. He said he was a victim of persecution and that some signatures had been forged. But the evidence was overwhelming. In one of the investigations, a wiretap revealed that he planned to blame Laura for the embezzlement, claiming that she had complete control over the transactions. The news came like a punch, albeit a predictable one. Laura was called to testify. He entered the room with a firm posture, eyes raised, and spoke clearly. He told what he knew, showed the documents he still had, revealed the context in which he had signed the contracts. The judge listened to her carefully. His testimony was included in the process as part of an extensive web of emotional manipulation used by the defendant to control and benefit from emotionally fragile women. She was cleared of criminal guilt but not public consequences. Her name, for a while, appeared in the newspapers, on blogs, on the networks. Even though she was innocent, the eyes judged her. But she didn't react. I knew that the truth lives in time, not in occasional comments. One day, leaving a hearing, he found Daniel on the other side of the sidewalk. He was alone, with a briefcase under his arm, wearing a light shirt and linen pants, as if he had just come from a light lunch by the sea. For a moment, I didn't know what to do. He thought about turning his back, crossing, disappearing. But he saw her. And then, in a slow gesture, he waved. It wasn't a warm wave, nor a cold one. It was serene. An acknowledgement from someone who no longer harbors any regrets, but who also does not wish to return. She approached hesitantly. They said hi almost at the same time. They talked for minutes. He asked how she was. She replied that she was living. He smiled and said that was already a lot. Laura asked if he was happy. Daniel replied that he had discovered that happiness was not constant, but he had found a peace that, for him, was enough. He said he had remarried, and that his wife was someone who brought lightness to everyday life, who didn't demand grandiosity, just truth. She swallowed the emotion with a forced smile. He said he was happy for him. Who honestly hoped that life would reward him for everything he had endured in silence. Daniel shook his head slightly. He said he didn't want rewards. That the freedom of no longer carrying pain was enough. That every choice has a price and that he chose to leave the past behind, even without forgetting. Laura tried to apologize once again, but he gently interrupted. He said that the pardon had already happened, even though it was never announced. He said that moving on is often the greatest form of forgiveness one can offer. And then, with the same serenity with which he appeared, he said goodbye, crossed the street and disappeared into the crowd. In the following months, Laura decided to change again. This time not because of escape, but because of the desire to start over in another space, with other landscapes. He chose a small town, close to a river, where he could teach and continue his community work. She was received with curiosity and, later, with affection. Neighbors called her by name, unaware of her past. She was not the woman who cheated, nor the ex in the scandal. It was just her. She got a place at a local school, started giving writing workshops to young people and created a small book club with women in the community. One afternoon, when he left school, he found a student sitting on the stairs, crying softly. He sat next to her, offered silence first, then words. The girl had discovered that her father had been keeping another family a secret for years. She felt betrayed, lost, helpless. Laura listened to her for an hour. And when the girl finished, she held her hand and said, with the firmness of someone who has lived through the worst storms, "What people do to us doesn't define who we are. What we choose to do afterwards, does." From that day on, he understood that perhaps this was his role in the world. Use pain not as an anchor, but as a bridge. Using guilt not as a chain, but as a reminder of who you no longer want to be. Her pain served another pain. And, in that gesture, something in Laura was healed. And as for Daniel, he never appeared publicly again. Rumors said that he had refused interviews, refused invitations to tell his story. He said he didn't need to turn his pain into entertainment. He created an NGO focused on the emotional restructuring of people who have suffered emotional violence and marital betrayal. He became a reference figure, but discreet. His current wife, a behavioral therapist, said Daniel was the most quietly strong man she had ever met. Laura, today, doesn't miss him. Miss what they were. Of what could have been. But he learned to live with what he is. Wrote a book about silent losses, Pseudonym. It was well received. No one suspected it was autobiographical. And she didn't confirm it. He didn't even deny it. Pain became raw material. Guilt became learning. And life, even with all the pieces, went on. And perhaps this is the biggest twist of all. When betrayal seemed to have destroyed everything, it was precisely this that revealed who each person really was. Daniel didn't become an avenger. He became a guide. Laura did not become a villain. She became a witness to herself. And the opportunist traitor, finally, had the ending his story deserved, alone, facing the consequences of his own games, without control, without charm, without escape. Now, tell me, what did you think of this story? Did the ending surprise you? Did it make you think of something you experienced or no? Leave your comment, I want to know your opinion. And of course, if you've made it this far, subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Always remember, this channel does not support, under any circumstances, any form of betrayal. Here, we tell stories to show that the truth, no matter how painful it may be, is always the best path. Until next time.